Now, before I say anything, I would just like to clarify that I am not going to be bashing the Dark Knight trilogy or trying to argue why they're actually bad movies in this video. That is not what I'm trying to say here at all, because I will be the first to admit that The Dark Knight in particular is a really great movie that deserves all the praise it's been given. What I will be addressing, however, is the impact the Dark Knight trilogy has had on the superhero genre as a whole. But before I get started, I would just like to warn you that there will be minor spoilers ahead for all three movies in the Dark Knight trilogy. So if you don't want anything ruined, you should probably come back after you have seen them. This will be the only spoiler warning I'll be giving out. Okay, so to go on a bit of a trip down memory lane for a moment, before Marvel came to dominate not only the superhero genre but the whole movie industry, various superhero movies started coming out in the late 1990s and throughout the 2000s, whose successes steadily increased in popularity, leading to Marvel's wide-scale success. Now, only some of these movies were the Blade series, the X-Men series, and Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, in addition to the Dark Knight trilogy, of course. But what made the Dark Knight trilogy different from the other aforementioned trilogies mainly came down to two things. The first being that, at the time at least, it was credited as having no bad movies of the bunch. Now, while some might disagree with that these days, I'm not going to touch on that in this video, as it's only important how people felt about them at the time. And the second reason is how grounded and serious they were. Because unlike Tim Burton's Batman movies, which were also pretty dark but still had an air of campiness or fun to them, or the Joel Schumacher movies, which were only slightly more serious than the Adam West Batman series of the 60s, the Dark Knight trilogy played everything completely seriously. His training, where he gets his gadgets, how he uses those gadgets, how he fights crime, and even other aspects such as his origin being heavily tied to the mob and having to face down his fair share of problems when fighting crime, such as dogs and people trying to imitate him. The point is, Christopher Nolan wrote these movies to believably take place in the real world, and he most certainly succeeded in that regard. So at this point, you're probably thinking, okay then, so what's the problem? You yourself just said that The Dark Knight deserves to be considered one of the best movies of all time. And that's exactly it. Because The Dark Knight is considered by most people to be the greatest superhero movie ever, and one of the best movies of all time, period. But the problem with this is that The Dark Knight and the trilogy as a whole are not true superhero movies. And before you start running to the comments to yell at me, please hear me out. Now, what's always important to remember is how different genres have different requirements and distinctions that must be met in order for a movie to be considered part of that genre, which is why some people have actually debated the true genre of some of the best movies out there, because sometimes it can be a hard thing to decipher. And it's no different with the superhero genre. It has its fair share of distinctions and things that it must be in order for it to be considered a superhero movie. And the Dark Knight trilogy only has them on the most superficial level. Because yes, the heroes, villains, and most of the side characters come from comic books, and the characters dress up in costumes, and the movies are centered around a hero and villain dynamic that culminates in a fight between the two. But other than that, those movies have almost nothing else tying them to the superhero genre, especially because the feeling behind those movies is also completely different. Because the conflict between Batman and any given villain only serves as a backdrop for the larger questions Christopher Nolan is trying to ask. And while superheroes do usually have their fair share of themes and questions, they're usually presented very differently than they are in the Dark Knight trilogy. To put it simply, If you were to strip away the costumes, these movies would be unrecognizable as superhero movies. Because Batman Begins has a lot more in common with a terrorist crime movie, The Dark Knight a psychological neo-noir, and The Dark Knight Rises a hostage movie with some disaster elements thrown in. In all honesty, it kind of reminds me of something somebody once said about the Angry Birds movie 2, of all things. And if you'll forgive the weird comparison, they basically said, in order to make the movie good, they had to abandon the fundamental nature of what the video game was all about in the first place, which is to say, the conflict between the pigs and the birds. And if you ask me, the exact same thing applies to the Dark Knight trilogy. That arguably the greatest superhero movie of all time isn't even a real superhero movie. Because as I just said, if Batman were a detective or policeman and the Joker just a psychotic crook, the movie would retain basically nothing from the superhero genre. Now, from there, the question then becomes, why is that? Why is arguably the greatest superhero movie ever not even a real superhero movie? And the answer for that mainly comes down to the fact that certain genres can be hard to successfully adapt into a visual medium. And the superhero, as well as the comic book genre as a whole, is one of them. Because let's face it, people who aren't huge fans of comics can easily find elements of them ridiculous, such as the costumes, certain plots, the names, and even the whole dynamic between certain heroes and villains, in addition to other things. In other words, it's a lot easier to accept it on the page than to actually see it happening in front of you on screen. This was the main reason that the Adam West TV series was so campy, because the writers knew that was the only way people in the 1960s would watch it. They knew they would never take the show seriously because of how ridiculous it all inherently seemed. So instead, they deliberately played it for laughs and went out of their way to make it as ridiculous as possible. And let's face it, that certainly made it a lot more memorable and probably got them a lot more viewers than had they tried to play the whole thing straight. This is also the main reason behind Marvel's signature quippy and sarcastic nature, because the people behind those movies know that even today, when people are much more accepting of superheroes and are willing to give them a lot more slack, that certain stuff they're presenting is just a little too ridiculous or silly for them to expect the audience to take completely seriously. So their solution to that problem was to have the characters themselves acknowledge it and play their exasperation and annoyance with how weird and ridiculous it all is for laughs, thereby making the audience laugh with them instead of at them. And at the same time, it also tells the audience that the writers themselves know that what they're doing is a little absurd, and thereby making the audience more accepting of it as a result. Although this mainly applies more to their early years, as by this point quips have just become a trademark of theirs and will put it in whether it's necessary or not. And that's also why it doesn't always work when other movies try to copy that brand of humor, because when characters start acknowledging the absurdity or ridiculousness of something in a situation that's more believable to the audience, it ends up making the whole thing just not feel right. So, to put it simply, the superhero genre as a whole is an inherently flawed one to adapt into live action. So, if you want to create one that's considered great, not just within the genre, but be considered a great movie on the whole, then you have to strip away most of the elements of the genre for that to work. Similar to what Angry Birds had done, and exactly what Christopher Nolan did. And the result was a trilogy that superficially resembled superhero movies, but in actuality had almost nothing in common with them. Now listen, for a character like Batman, who was always a more serious and grounded superhero, 60 series aside, it was okay to take this approach. In other words, even if they didn't feel like superhero movies, they still felt like Batman movies. If with a tone that few had really seen before. So the problem doesn't lie so much in the movies themselves, but what happened as a result of them. Because the success of both the Dark Knight trilogy and the MCU happened at around the same time, and both of them had pretty much opposite styles of how to adapt a superhero story into a movie, which led people to either crave the dead serious approach or the more fun and sarcastic approach. Now, as I probably don't even have to tell you, Marvel's tone pretty much won out in the end, mainly because unlike the Dark Knight trilogy, they didn't stop and because their approach was much more faithful to the genre in general. However, the impact of the Dark Knight trilogy has still definitely been felt, because there have also been plenty of extremely dark superhero movies obviously made in the style of the trilogy, but these movies usually have sparked backlash because they didn't feel like superhero movies and don't accurately reflect the essence of their characters. And before any of you say it, yes, I know there have been plenty of dead serious comic books over the years, but the thing is, they're much rarer and usually not the ones being adapted into movies. If they were, then a more serious tone would be very appropriate. But it's the more fun characters that are usually given the adaptations, which is what leads to these issues. But where I feel this is even more apparent is in people's clamoring for superhero movies to be more serious. They've seen what a completely straight, serious, and nuanced superhero movie could look like, and now want all movies to reflect that. And listen, I'm not saying that superhero movies shouldn't be serious or have serious moments. I'm not saying that Thor Love and Thunder is the perfect superhero movie here. For instance, Spider-Man 2 is a pretty serious movie, but yet still manages to retain the essence of what the superhero genre should be. Sam Raimi understood how to balance these two elements. I just think the problem is that superhero movies are a genre that was born out of fun and imagination. Even when geared towards adults, there are certain ridiculous elements to them that you just can't ignore. To put it simply, the Dark Knight trilogy is only an exception, not the rule or the new norm. Superhero movies can never be as dead serious as other movie genres, and if too many of them try to be, then you end up losing what made them superhero movies in the first place. To put it simply, the Dark Knight trilogy may be an exercise in great filmmaking, but it's not what all, or even most, superhero movies should strive to be. Okay, I think that's everything I wanted to say. So now I want you to tell me, do you think the Dark Knight trilogy is the perfect template for all superhero movies to follow? Or do you believe I've got a point in that no matter how good they aren't true superhero movies? Please feel free to tell me in the comments. But let's try and keep it a civil discussion here, because I know people can get a little passionate about topics like this. And as always, I don't have any problem if you disagree with me. If you think I'm dead wrong about this entire video, I've got no issue with you. And thank you all for watching. I very greatly appreciate it. And I hope to see you all next time.